Hello and welcome to the National Adaptation Forum webinar series, and particularly our Summer Rewind series, Part 2, hosted by EcoAdapt. This webinar is the online convening of the adaptation community between the biennial National Adaptation Forum events. Visit the National Adaptation Forum website to learn more about past forums, including our most recent gathering in April 2019. We are currently planning for the 5th National Adaptation Forum, which will take place in spring 2022 in Atlanta, Georgia. I especially want to thank you all for taking the time to be here today. I know there's a lot going on in the world right now, so just really appreciate you taking the time to spend this next hour with us. I'm Molly Johnston. I'm one of the National Adaptation Forum organizers, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, where we will be revisiting A Match Made in Heaven, integrating climate change into hazard mitigation planning. Before we get started, I want to go through some housekeeping rules that will help us to make sure this is a successful webinar. So please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute for now. This will help us to reduce any feedback. If you're using the microphone voice over IP option, please ensure that your computer is on mute, even if you are listed as muted when you logged in. We will have time after this presentation for a special Q&A, live Q&A session. So throughout the webinar, please submit any questions you might have through the question function in your control panel. We will do our best to answer all of them. And please also use that question function to report any technical issues you might have. Our team will also do our best to help you address any of those problems to ensure you have a favorable webinar experience. We will be recording and posting this webinar on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing, and that can be found at www.cakex.org. Should be available within the next week. So finally, much of this webinar will consist of replaying the original webinar that was recorded this past February. And so sound for this video will only be available through your computer speakers. Keep in mind that if you called in via the phone, you won't be able to hear this portion unless you turn on your computer speakers. So once again, if you have any trouble with that, reach out to us via the question box and we'll do our best to resolve any issues. So joining us today live is Kristin Baja from the original webinar. And Baja works for the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. She's a program director for climate resilience and helps cities advance climate resilience planning and implementation. Baja focuses her time on supporting members and partners and centering equity in their climate and sustainability work. The webinar recording will also feature presenters who were with us in February, and starting with Sasha Peterson, who is the founder of Adaptation International. He has worked on climate change for more than 13 years. Sasha is focused on bridging the gaps between climate change science, policy, and action. You'll also see Eric Chapman, Sr., who is an enrolled member of Lactiflampo Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Indians. He serves as the Emergency Management Coordinator, Climate Resilience Project Director, and Manolman or Wild Rice Enhancement Program Manager. Finally, we'll have Jonathan Olds, who is the lead Hazard Mitigation Assistance Specialist in FEMA Region 10. He serves as the Idaho, Oregon, Alaska Program Lead for FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. And I want to point out there are 2 handouts available in your control panel that you can download, and they have additional resources to help you in your own hazard mitigation planning process. So with all of that, I will now present the clipped version of the original webinar. And then we'll have a live Q&A session that will take place after, where once again, you can submit any questions you have, and Baja will be with us to answer them. As a reminder, one more time, the sound for this video will only be available through your computer speakers. So be sure to turn up your computer volume and reach out if you have any difficulties. Finally, you can also make the video larger on your screen by clicking View at the top bar and selecting View Full Screen. So with that said, again, here is A Match Made in Heaven, integrating climate change into hazard mitigation planning, which will start off with presenter Sasha Peterson.
Great. Thank you, Molly, and thank you everyone for joining this encore presentation of a panel discussion that happened in the last National Adaptation Forum. If you go ahead to the next slide, Molly, I'm going to take us all back to the end of May, Memorial Day weekend in 2015. Many of you were probably spending time with friends and family, grilling out on a nice sunny day, but that's not what was happening in Austin, Texas. At that time, the rain had been pummeling the city for about a day and a half, and areas of town were flooding, such as the Shoal Creek area here, there where you can clearly see that the river is no longer confined to the creek bed, but it's flowing out over city streets and affecting businesses and homes. Community members throughout town were trapped in portions of the city that were at higher elevation, not necessarily in immediate danger, but unable to connect with family members or go to the grocery store because the streets themselves had become the water conveyance due to the amount of water that was pouring down over the course of that Memorial Day weekend. And that is actually not a new phenomenon for Texas. That flood was the center flood in 300-year plus floods that happened in Central Texas over the course of 5 years. So that's an indication of, the climate challenge that we're all facing with more extreme precipitation events leading to more flooding. It's not just due to, increased impervious cover with, more people, but more people are getting in the way of these streams and flows and building houses in places that will be affected. So it got me thinking about the hazard mitigation planning process and the climate resilience planning side of things, and thinking about how we use historical climate and weather data to inform our planning processes, and whether that's sufficient moving forward in order to prepare our communities and help them be more resilient to future climate and weather-related events. Can you go to the next slide? Most of our hazard planning is based on historical data. You can see here that those historical parameters are changing drastically. So this is from NOAA's Atlas for rainfall, a 24-hour, 100-year event in Austin up until a year or so ago was dubbed to be 10.2 inches. So that's a lot of rain in a short amount of time. But when they recently revised the Atlas, looking at these historical events, such as the ones, the Memorial Day flood in 2015, you can see they revised it significantly upward, and now the current 24-hour, 100-year rainfall event for Austin is 13 inches. So, but again, that's historical data, and that's not looking at where climate projections may take the region. So if you go to the next slide, we're all familiar with this type of information, looking at, the number of billion-dollar weather, extreme weather, climate-related events across the United States. On the left-hand side, in the lower portion of the slide, you can see that the number of these events is increasing year over year, particularly strong in the last decade. And then on the right, it's just the number of billion-dollar weather events from last year. You can see that a lot of it's driven by flooding and hurricanes in the south central region, but there's also wildfires out in California that are affecting those. So all of this, compounding effects, the drive to more extreme precipitation or extreme weather affecting the community, really motivated me to think about the hazard mitigation planning process. I come from a climate adaptation and resilience space and have just now started to think about those connections. So if you go to the next slide, these two graphics, show a little bit of a comparison. On the left-hand side, this is from the Adaptation chapter of the National Climate Assessment. year or so ago, and it shows the adaptation and resilience planning process. It starts with awareness up on the top, and then you assess your climate and extreme weather related risks, move into planning for those risks, hopefully implementing those plans, and then monitoring the success of those plans. And in those inner circles, you can see the progress that was made across the nation from the 2014 assessment to the 2018 assessment, moving in the right direction and filling in that circle. Despite the fact that it goes clockwise and the other disaster life cycle goes counterclockwise, there's some strong similarities. We start with kind of strategic planning and preparedness, maybe implementing risk reduction methods in order to mitigate that risk. Then there's a disaster, a big event that happens, and you have to respond to that event real time. And then you hopefully strategically rebuild in a way that reduces risk for future events. So these processes are very similar, but the history of these two fields is very different. Disaster mitigation, hazard planning has been around for decades, where the heart of the climate resilience and adaptation movement is much more recent. The lexicon is different. When we use the term mitigation in the climate space, it means one thing, greenhouse gas emissions reduction. If you use mitigation in the hazard space, it means, taking action to reduce risk from extreme weather events. And so the traditions are different, the planning timeframes are different. Frequently disaster and hazard mitigation timeframe is much shorter, focused on immediately before, during, and after an event. So while I'm enticed to merge these fields together and look at the way that we can do climate smart hazard planning, it's definitely more challenging than it may look on the surface. I'm grateful for the work that the Lac du Flambeau tribe has done on climate smart hazard mitigation planning. We were fortunate enough to be able to collaborate with them, and it really opened my eyes to kind of the potential disconnects and opportunities between these two fields. So if you go to the next slide, some of the questions that I've been pondering over the last year or so through the course of that project is, how can we move beyond, cookie cutter hazard mitigation planning? And I'm sure you've all seen this, where an individual town's hazard mitigation plan is very similar to another town, maybe in a different area. A few names have been changed or actions have been changed, but the plan itself is not significantly different. And I wonder if that was really suiting the needs of the community, or just checking a box with FEMA so that disaster funding would be available. I'm also wondering, what constitutes meaningful community engagement? If you're updating a hazard mitigation plan and you have $30,000 or $40,000 in order to do it, is it really adequate to do 2 town hall meetings and publish some things on the webpage? How do you reach out to the most affected frontline members of the community, those who have been historically marginalized and pushed into high-risk areas that are then most affected by the extreme weather events? How do you engage those people and help crafting actions that are then implementable in those communities, by those communities? And does mainstreaming climate concerns into hazard mitigation plans even make sense? We talk a lot in the field about mainstreaming and building climate change to these existing requirements, planning processes, and does it make sense here? Is looking forward instead of looking into the past make a big enough difference in the community's hazard plan that it's worth investment and helps increase community resilience? On the intro, I'm going to hand it over to the panelists, which I'm really excited to share with you. We have 3 great speakers that are going to provide some real-world examples from their experience, either working in a community or with communities on their climate resilience and hazard mitigation planning efforts, and then we should have time for panel discussion and questions. Go ahead, Molly, to the next couple of slides. This will be in the package. But Adaptation International, we're a small mission-driven organization focused on helping build resilience and partner with communities at different levels across the country and help them, on the next slide, develop a process that's meaningful and engages with community members and helps develop adaptation strategies that are useful in the community. Go to my last slide. I'm going to turn it over to our great set of panelists. Kristin, Eric, and Jonathan have extensive experience in this area and all bring a unique perspective from different parts of the country and different communities that they've worked with, and they'll help fill in some of the skeleton that I laid out in some of these questions and give us some real world examples. So Kristin, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Sasha, I appreciate it. Thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Kristin Baja. I go by Baja, and I'm the Program Director for Climate Resilience with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, USDN. And if you have not heard of USDN before, it is a network of around 230 local governments in North America that are progressing forward beyond sort of just plans and workshops, but using peer learning to accelerate the pace of implementation and actually coming together around innovation and innovative new processes to be able to look at changing the way that government's currently structured. So we've been doing a lot with our members coming together, supporting each other, and also trying to change some of the systems that we work within, acknowledging that government is a system that's sometimes broken and needs to be going through some corrective action. So if you would go to the next slide. One of the ways that we're really looking at that, and as Sasha mentioned before, is rejecting the cookie cutter approach. You know, I think a lot of us have worked on hazard mitigation plans and the sort of traditional planning of bringing people to a meeting that we, you know, will advertise for or post online or put up on a flyer, have a plan already kind of put together or a project put together or the data already structured, and having that brought to people, but actually only to the people who show up where we want them to show up and when we want them to show up, and if they're willing to do it for free. And it really lacks in respect for people, and it lacks in that sort of understanding of how unique and different everyone is, and how we really need to be changing up the structure of not just the plan and the content of these plans, but our entire process and approach and the way that we're working with people as part of that process. So we've been focusing a lot on not just changing, like I was saying, kind of what Sasha was saying with the use of the historic data and the sort of old school structure that we have, but also really looking at what is the process and how are we changing that process. So in that, resilience and adaptation seems to be where we're getting a lot of progress right now in thinking about this work differently. And so the climate adaptation and resilience work really mirrors a lot of what we see with all hazard mitigation, where you do things like identifying hazards, you do risk and vulnerability assessment, strategies and actions for success. But we really have been looking at how are we reframing this approach. If we're just starting with our hazard identification and thinking about things that have impacted us, how are we actually going beyond the data that we're collecting from GIS and from articles that we had, and actually starting to value people and their data and their information, thinking about qualitative data as much as we are the things that we already have. And then also recognizing our trends and our trend lines, and recognizing that all of people, neighborhoods, and cities are unique, and so this one size doesn't fit all. Resilience has become a word that's been helping in sort of the bipartisan space of getting folks willing to talk about climate change without actually saying climate change. Adaptation is something we're saying, you know, essentially at this point, we can't be doing climate mitigation without adaptation, and vice versa. We need to be focusing on greenhouse gas emission reduction at the same time as adaptation and hazard mitigation, but they all mirror each other in so many different ways. So one of the things we're actually focused on is in the space of resilience and looking at this match with hazard mitigation, how are we thinking about it differently? How are we framing it differently? Instead of it being around react, respond, and sort of focusing on the post-disaster or even the disaster itself, how are we reframing it? And so we're looking at resilience in 3 different modes, where the normal everyday mode is where we actually spend most of our time, and it's actually where the least number of our resources are spent. And so trying to shift that within government and to focus more on our proactive opportunities with resilience and adaptation, and integrating that into the way we're doing hazard mitigation work. Next slide. Also, when we're thinking about the disruption and recovery spaces, which are heavily tied into hazard mitigation and often where the majority of the money and the capacity are given, how are we starting to think about those differently and focus more on elements related to trauma ongoing trauma. As Sasha was saying, where you have ongoing floods or floods that are happening over and over and over, there's an element of trauma that comes along with that we're not considering. We're also not considering people's unique differences in the way that we react and respond. We're putting everybody in the same type of setting, through the same type of process, through the same type of communication. And that's really devaluing people. Next slide. So the focus is really on using hazard mitigation plans, but also climate adaptation work to recenter the work on people and to shift that. And as you saw in Sasha's slide with those two circles, they're centered around a disaster. The disaster or the hazard is at the center of that circle, and we do all of the planning and the process around it. Why are we doing that? It shouldn't be centered on the hazard. Even with a hazard mitigation plan, we should still be centering on people and their quality of life and how are we benefiting them every single day as an element of becoming more resilient communities and as an element of being able to withstand and thrive amongst these changing climate conditions. So getting out of this idea of centering on the hazard and focusing more on the value of people, focusing on their needs, using their stories, not just focusing on the building and the contents of the building when we're talking about the value of the space and how we're going to prioritize it, but focusing on who's there, why they're there, how that building's being used, and what's the connectivity with the rest of the community around it. And in that, it requires integration. I think there's been a lot of pushes to create sort of standalone climate resilience plans or standalone climate adaptation plans. And the all hazard mitigation planning process, and I think most of us on the call can agree, is it's still pretty archaic. And so this is a really amazing opportunity. Instead of creating a lot of these standalone plans, because all hazard mitigation plans are something that are required for state, local, and tribal governments, how can we actually start to integrate these better and think about our climate trend lines, our sort of anticipated impacts that we know are coming, the things we're already seeing, but also the structure of these plans themselves. The fact that there are only 2 mandatory meetings that are required and you have an advisory committee. The structure is, you're going through your hazard assessment, your risk and vulnerability assessment, and then creating this plan. How are we flipping that? How are we thinking about it differently? What are the questions that we're asking that are different? Who's impacted most and why are they impacted most? Is it because of our racist policies and practices? Is it because we've put people into harm's way for long periods of time due to our redlining? And the answer is most likely yes. And so how, as we're thinking through integrating into these plans and thinking about climate action with these plans, are we also addressing equity and addressing the fact that we have communities that have been disenfranchised due to our policies and practices? And how do we start to shift to a more targeted universalism approach, which is acknowledging that all people's needs matter, but that we need to be focusing our time and capacity on the marginalized groups and rejecting that blanket approach. So the thing I'll kind of leave you with, since we only have about 10 minutes per presenter today, is just to acknowledge that change is the new normal. A lot of the times when I say to folks, wow, we should switch up the all hazard mitigation plan and really incorporate climate change and social equity, they say, well, that's not what we're used to doing. We have a structure in place. This is how we get graded. We get checkboxed on elements and all these other pieces. But we need to be able to change as things are changing around us. And we cannot keep replicating the same approaches that we have to this work because it's not working. It's not working fast enough and it's not working connected enough. So the sort of reframing of the work, the restructuring of the work, the thinking about the process in addition to the content, integrating that sort of proactive component and prioritizing that over the reactive. And then, as I mentioned, really focusing on the targeted universalism as we're going through and thinking about not just approach in the way we're developing the plan, but also the implementation, and recognizing that we have these opportunities to make a positive change that really value people and value people as part of the process, rather than just going through the cookie cutter that we're given from the federal level right now. So I'll say change is hard, but I think if we embrace it, we can all really shape some new and amazing approaches. And I will leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you. That's awesome. I'm gonna put some notes on a few of those phrases, centering the work on people and the new normal, so appreciate it. Eric, it's your turn.
Bonjour from Waswagening. Hello from Lac du Flambeau. Our Indian reservation, known as the Lux Thermal Reservation, is located in northern Wisconsin. part of my duties are I'm the tribe's emergency management coordinator. I'm also have the responsibility to develop our climate resilience initiative. I'm the project director. I also head up our wild rice restoration program, and I'm also have the honor and privilege to serve my people as a tribal council member. As you can see on the slide, it just depicts where our reservation is located in reference to the United States and Wisconsin. Part of our climate resilience initiative, we wanted to make sure that we recognized our boundaries within the reservation, yet also our project area would be 40 to 50 miles from our reservation. Lux Thermal Tribe is signatory to the Treaty of 1837, 1854, 1842, and 1836. A lot of our tribal members still hunt, fish, and gather in those areas, but majority of the time it's, they travel that distance, which is why we identified our project boundary. This is just a little bit more info on our reservation. 86,000 acres, 260 inland lakes. We have many miles of streams and rivers. With all those lakes come with it a lot of wetland, and we do have some forested areas. The picture on the far right is the aerial view of the Lux Thermal Reservation. As I mentioned, we have a lot of water, a lot of wetland. The picture in the middle is the logo that a couple of our spiritual advisors developed for us. We wanted to make sure our project had its own identity. The wording says Gagige, Bimadaziwin, Gawin, Gayabi, and Izanasanun, and that stands for, we will be resilient for future generations. The eagle at the top represents, that spirit that will protect us from above. The martin in the dome-shaped structure represents the Martin clan, and they're considered like the warriors of our tribe, and they'll protect us from the things that threaten us from below, from the ground. The dome shape represents the wigwams that we once lived in, represents our community, and we'll be resilient as a community together. So part of our climate resilience initiative, we wanted to make sure that we do a vulnerability assessment and identify key concerns that we as the Lux Thermal community recognize. We want to make sure we look at tribal environment, health concerns, and also infrastructure. At the same time, we wanted to roll into adaptation planning. We wanted to make sure that we identified actions the community can take to prepare for climate change tomorrow and in the future. And also part of the initiative was to develop a hazard mitigation plan, and we hope to reduce both natural and man-made risks to our community now and in the future. And another component is our energy reduction plan. We wanted to make sure that we also reduce our carbon footprint, because I think it's important for everybody to try to do their share to reduce energy, save money, and decrease greenhouse gas emissions. So why do we need a hazard mitigation plan? We want to make sure that we're developing and implement a plan that would help the Lux Thermal tribe create a healthier, safer, and more resilient community for the next 7 generations. We want to make sure that in 7 generations from now, our children and their grandchildren will be able to, enjoy the beauty and, all those other things that the Creator put here for us. So we wanted to make sure that we also followed the FEMA hazard mitigation planning process. We wanted to make sure our community was engaged, helped us identify, key hazards that we would face now and in the future. We analyze, the current and future risks. We were able to incorporate, different temperature and precipitation, projections. We also developed hazard mitigation plans, actions. And then, we want to make sure that the plan just didn't sit on a shelf. There's some requirements for us to review the plan and make any changes if necessary. Next slide. So this slide just depicts some of the changes that we expect to see temperature and precipitation-wise. And this represents the picture on the left. By mid-century, the area that the reservation is located is expected to be 4.5 degrees warmer. The picture on the right shows the projections for end of century, and our area is expected to be 8.1 to 8.6 degrees warmer. And as far as the annual precipitation, by mid-century, we expect to see an additional 2 inches of rain. By end of century, we expect to see 4.7 inches of rain. Next slide, please. But we wanted to make sure our community and tribal programs and staff were engaged in not only just the hazard mitigation, but also with developing our climate resilience plan. So we identified key programs and put together a tribal emergency planning committee. And what we have listed there is about 23 programs. 2 of the programs listed, the public school and the fire department, are not tribally owned. Those are like general public entities. Next slide, please. And this just shows some of our team members, brainstorming on different threats and how to deal with them. We wanted to make sure our tribal government was engaged, so our team, along with Adaptation International, who was our contractor that helped us and is still helping us with our climate resilience initiative. We were doing a presentation to our governing board. So our team and community, we identified 13 hazards that we have included in our hazard mitigation plan. Through various discussions, ranking, we have to pretty much list what we considered serious threats and not quite so serious, but we still had concerns about those threats harming our community members. If you notice the second hazard from the top, illegal drug crisis. If you look at a lot of plans out there right now, they don't have that in there. But we wanted to make sure that we were able to face that threat head on. We're only a small community of about 2,000 year-round residents. We're tourist oriented, so our population swells to maybe 4 times that much. But we have that illegal drug issue, just like a lot of communities throughout the United States, and we want to make sure that we have developed actions on how to deal with that. Next slide, please. For example, these are some of our actions that we're taking, and these are right out of our hazard mitigation plan. We'll continue to update our tribal action plan, and our action plan is making sure that there's no silos between various tribal programs, mental health, tribal police department, drug and endangered children, to make sure that everybody's working together. We'll continue to, enhance our counseling efforts. We'll enhance our police enforcement on drug interdiction. We'll continue to support our drug and endangered children and adult response team. We will review our mental health screening process. We want to build a safe house for children and families dealing with an emerging drug situation. Next slide, please. So if anybody wants to view our completed and FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan, you should go to www.ldftribe.com, click on other pages, and then click on hazard mitigation plan. Next slide, please. And this just shows, some of the threats that we're dealing with. The picture on the left is a abandoned railroad bed that we use for emergency access road if need be. The last 2 years, because of the rain events, it's actually got flooded for about a week and a half to 2 weeks. The picture on the right is my granddaughter. She's 9 years old. This was taken last year, and you can kind of see, the snow depth that we got. This is in late February of last year, and it's like she's just sitting there waiting for the snow to melt so she can jump on her slide and have fun. Next slide, please. So with that, I say miigwech, thank you on behalf of our Tribal Emergency Planning Committee.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thanks for all the work that the tribe is doing in this area. Jonathan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So real quickly, Region 10 is Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and Alaska. The Hazard Mitigation Assistance team that I work with, what we do is we review and award funding, grant funding for hazard mitigation projects and hazard mitigation planning projects. Next slide. So what I'm first going to touch on here a little bit is where our authority comes from, where the programs come from, and where you can get information on how they operate. So to address escalating disaster costs in the U.S., back in 2000, Congress passed the Disaster Mitigation Act. The purpose is to reduce the loss of life and property, to reduce human suffering, reduce economic disruption, and also to reduce disaster assistance costs. The 44 CFR is where the regulations that implement that act are housed. As part of that, it requires that hazard mitigation plans are approved by FEMA to be eligible for hazard mitigation assistance grants. It's not, you don't have to have these plans in place to be eligible for disaster response and recovery funding, but for hazard mitigation assistance grants, you do need these approved plans. And they have to be updated every 5 years. So there's this ongoing cycle. It's a carrot program where if you do this planning, we can provide you money to work on projects. Now, within the program, plans shall include information on the probability of future hazard events. How that's been done in the past, and this is the area that's changing, especially with, I mean, Sasha was absolutely right. Historically, what we've done is we've looked at what are the events that have occurred in the past and plan based on that. And now that our climate is changing, we can't predict in the same way that we have in the past. Not to say that it was ever entirely accurate, but we know that it's a moving trajectory. These programs, although they are FEMA programs, they are administered by the states and by federally recognized tribes. The guidance that you see here for the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and also for the Tribal and State Mitigation Plan Review speak to inclusion of addressing climate adaptation and the commitment to build resilient communities. So built into our legislation and guidance gives us the capability to address climate adaptation within what we have today. We have 3 grant programs primarily. 2 of them are annual cycles, and one of them kicks in after a disaster declaration in the state. It's the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which kicks in after a disaster declaration, and it has been the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program that has funded many of the hazard mitigation plans, and that's available on an annual cycle. The name of that program we expect to change in the coming year, but we still expect this annual cycle. So I'm going to touch on a few hazard mitigation plans that have integrated climate adaptation at some level into them. This plan, the Snohomish County Multi-Jurisdictional Plan, is in Washington State. At the time that this was done, which is 6 years ago, and I happened to be on the team that worked on this, the standard approach to integrating the hazard information for climate change was to take the regional climate assessment, summarize it, include it in the plan, but not really speak to specific vulnerabilities in the community or have very specific data in terms of, well, what kind of impacts can we expect from that? So Snohomish County chose to contract with the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington to get more information on how would changing climate impact the flooding in the region, because riverine flooding is a hazard that they regularly have to deal with. Through that work of the Climate Impacts Group, they learned that in a 40-year time period, we can expect, based upon climate projections, what would be the figure you have in front of you, the historical 10-year flood, or would become, on average, every 5 years. And then it actually changes to every 2.5 years if you look 80 years out. So it's like we start seeing a trend here in terms of the frequency of these events and the impacts. So they were actually able to fund this work with the Climate Impacts Group as part of the climate mitigation planning process. Next slide. The city of Santa Cruz focused on climate adaptation in their 2012 Hazard Mitigation Plan update. So communities that have a plan, they need to update it every 5 years. In that update, the community decides how and what we need to do the update on. One of the questions we ask, or the questions we ask in reviewing these proposals, is what are the deficiencies in the old plan? What are the proposed improvements? And for some hazards, you may not need to do a new risk and vulnerability assessment, but for hazards that are changing based upon changes in the climate, there is a need. And so the city of Santa Cruz chose to focus on climate adaptation, or the climate impacts and climate adaptation in this update. And they used the tools developed by or funded by the state of California to assist communities in that analysis. Here's a multi-jurisdictional plan that was done by City of Olympia. It was part of the Thurston County plan. They're looking at sea level rise. They have it mapped and risks identified in their plan. They also went out and did a separate sea level rise response plan. Now, I also have a slide, next slide. I want to go 2 slides here. I have a slide on the Quinault Indian Nation. They included not only scientific data, but also tribal knowledge in their planning. So I wanted to speak to this before we go into the discussion, how to be successful in integrating more into your hazard mitigation plans. One is, in your community, do you have leadership and community support to do that integration? We find communities that do have that support can bring together the resources and different departments to do the work. Who's going to lead the effort? Historically, this has been in the emergency manager's wheelhouse, but we also get plans that are led by the planning department or some other entity within the jurisdiction. It doesn't have to be the emergency manager's office. So who leads that effort needs to be determined, and they need to be on board with the vision of integrating climate adaptation. What information is going to be needed to identify, prioritize, and generate support for hazard mitigation and climate adaptation strategy? Also, as part of this information, is like, what process do you want to use with the community? Think about that before you apply for the grant. And what methods of analysis do you want to use? Pull that all together, put that in the scope of work, cost estimate, and schedule. If you do that initial work looking at how we want to integrate climate adaptation into the plan, we can fund the work. It just needs to be outlined in the scope of work, cost estimate, and schedule ahead of time. And in terms of timing, we have a 5-year cycle for updates. Look at how long you're going to take to do your actual mitigation planning. That may be 2 years, depending upon the type of outreach in the community. Well, start working your way back. That means you're going to need to apply for this grant maybe 3 years before the work needs to be completed, because we're going to look at it. We prioritize planning grants to get through our process, but often it takes a year to get funding out the door. So you need to do this pre-planning immediately in preparation for the next update cycle.
Okay, thank you for watching that great clip, informational clip. And before we get started with the live Q&A with Baja, I want to point people to the handouts that are available in the handout portion of your control panel that you can download with extra resources. And also just remind you that you can still submit questions if anything comes up during the next few minutes. But now I'd like to welcome Baja here. Are you there?
Yep, I sure am.
Hey, so just to get us started, do you have any updates you want to share with us regarding your presentation from this past February? Definitely a lot has changed since then, so.
Yeah, I don't actually think that much about the approach that we're taking has changed. I think it aligns actually a lot with where we are right now, really getting out of the cookie cutter, moving into changing both the process and the content and thinking about the unique differences in the reframing. We have certainly moved forward in creating some of the guidance that we're going to be testing with USDN members on opportunities to both integrate social equity and climate change into their all hazard mitigation plans. So we're actually actively working through that process right now and testing it out with members and framing it around the 3 modes of resilience that I mentioned. So there's not a lot of change necessarily from what I presented before, but I do think there's a lot of alignment that matches with what we're seeing in today's current environment.
Okay, great to hear. We had one question sent in that was from Joy Brown, and Joy asked, how can we increase the use of nature-based projects and solutions in hazard mitigation planning?
Yeah, I think actually it's a really great goal and a good question. I think one of the major things that we're looking at right now is looking at a cost benefit differently. Most local governments and even the federal and state governments use a traditional cost benefit analysis, which harms a lot of these projects because it comes back to what is the cheapest, the fastest, and the easiest. And what we're trying to do is actually say, if you look at things over time, these nature-based solutions actually have even more benefits. They're just difficult to quantify in some ways. So we are also incorporating into this new guidance a more comprehensive benefit cost analysis that is less traditional and looks at sort of the cascading benefits related to green infrastructure and human health benefits. So, you know, if it's something that you're working on right now without any guidance, that would be something I would look at, is just trying to understand the quantitative and qualitative benefits, and then also just having options, you know, putting alongside a hard gray infrastructure solution what the green infrastructure opportunity could be, so that folks have a way to see that there's another option on the table.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful, I think. We had a question submitted by Natalie Hernandez, and it kind of speaks to what you were mentioning regarding what you're working on now. But Natalie was surprised to see that the drug crisis could be incorporated into a hazard mitigation plan. Do you think issues like homelessness can be considered a hazard mitigation issue as well? And what other range of issues have you seen?
Yeah, I absolutely do think drug crisis, homelessness, all kinds of social issues. I think a lot of the sort of everyday stressors that are experienced can absolutely be integrated into these plans. I think that it's better done if they're connected in a lot of ways, where they're being exacerbated by some of these disruptions, but also looked at on their own. So I wouldn't just put them on their own, but I would also integrate them into the way that they're exacerbated by some of the bigger shocks. Some of the other things I've seen integrated, you know, there's certainly stuff related to pandemics. There are elements related to sort of cyber terrorism and things like that, even though it's not natural. It's elements that we rely on for a lot of our natural systems related to water management and other things. So they're integrated in. Air quality is one that's not usually thought about, but was integrated into a few of the plans that I've seen, and thinking about air sheds. So I think these plans, you can be more flexible with them as long as you have a good way of framing why you're integrating that component into the plan, how it connects to the basis of the plan or the basic structure of the plan, and you know, where the funding would be utilized to kind of reduce harm and risk.
Okay, fantastic. We have another, I'll just keep moving so you can get to, we have a lot of great questions. We have another question from Samantha, and Samantha said, you mentioned centering stakeholder outreach around people rather than creating a structure with organizers, dictating time and place, and then asking community members to volunteer their time. Do you have suggestions of what this might look like? So, of centering stakeholder outreach around people.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is a whole nother hour-long conversation. The idea, I think, if I'm going to put it briefly, is respecting people and respecting their knowledge and their time. We often get the usual suspects, or the people that can come to the table who have the time, and often they aren't the ones who are on the front lines being impacted on a daily basis and suffering sort of the both the shocks and the stressors. And so I think that it's really important to remember and to do your best to value people's time by paying them for their time, by going to places that they trust, that they feel comfortable, not requiring them to come into a local government building that's often really not set up for success. I think using different language and certainly recognizing that often folks in government are not the right people to be having these conversations, especially because government has traditionally let down many of the Black, Indigenous, and people of color of this country, and continues to. And so it's looking at what I call a shifting of power, essentially allowing community members to set agendas, allowing community members to identify what they want to talk about, and having the dialogue be more respectful, be more empathetic, the approach being less structured and certainly not around PowerPoints, which I think is what we do a lot of, and instead looking at building relationships and treating people with respect, getting down to the basics of what does it mean to thrive amidst these climate conditions, and how are we thinking about enhancing quality of life rather than just coming in with our own agenda. I'm happy to also talk about that in more depth with that individual at another time. Like I said, that's a really long question answer.
Yeah, I can connect you guys together. That's great. We had an interesting question sent in by Jacqueline. Jacqueline asked or said the pros of integrating climate change into hazard mitigation planning seem very clear. However, what are the challenges or cons? For example, does adding adaptation strategies into a hazard mitigation plan have any kind of legal binding for a jurisdiction? How can these be linked to other plans or processes that do have those legally binding components?
So an all hazard mitigation plan is essentially it's a guidance document. What you put into an all hazard mitigation plan is not a commitment to getting everything in that plan done within the next 5 years. I think that as you're integrating climate change and thinking about adaptation, it's okay to put in ambitious elements that will take a longer period of time and will also take external implementation partners, as long as you're clear in the plan that this is something that needs longer time but needs to be addressed now and be considered now and given capacity, time, and funding now. So it certainly doesn't hurt to add those things into the plan. There's nothing where you're going to get sued for not getting it done, but it is something where you're going to be reporting on progress and success and where you are in the steps. And so I would frame it in a way that this is a greater timeline and requires these additional partners, but we are focusing on it as a greater project towards risk reduction.
Thank you so much. I think I'll have that be our last question for today. As always, I'm happy to connect anyone afterwards to further the work that's taking place. But once again, Baja, thank you for taking the time to be here and with us today and letting us replay this webinar. Also, everyone who is here, thank you for being here. And we will have this recording available to you within the next week. It'll be posted on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, and you'll receive the link as well as a download of the PowerPoint. So you can, when you go to CAKE, you can also find hundreds of other adaptation resources, including case studies and resources related to today's session. We have currently, for the forum, we have a call for proposals open for our next webinar series relating to drought, fire, and extreme heat. So you can email us directly if you're interested or want to learn more about that at info@nationaladaptationforum.org. And you can also suggest any other webinar topics that you might be interested in the post-webinar survey that you'll take after this. So with all of that said, I just want to once again wish you well wishes. I hope you all stay well out there and have a great rest of your day. And we'll see you next time.